became more and more restricted in terms of their rule. In fact, many of the outskirts and the other dynasties around them became, in fact, more powerful than them. But you'll see that the Abbasid, at the peak of their powers here, they conquered what's called Transoxania, which is Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and into Armenia, and you see how it kind of spread and into more of Pakistan as well, with modern-day Pakistan. So now I feel bad for putting these slides because you won't be able to see this at all. But you see that there's an overlapping time period, 1193. That's during the Abbasid time period. But this is, in fact, what happened is around 900, there was one of the Bani Umayyah, I think, but he joined with one of the Berber tribes in North Africa, and he converted them to Ismaili Shi'ism, and he brought them in, and they took over Egypt, and that became the Fatimid dynasty, and they actually ruled Egypt from 900 to around 1100. So that was during the Abbasid rule. So you see, the Abbasids lost Egypt for almost 200 years, and it was only Sultan al-Ayyubi who came and took it back, and hence established the Ayyubid dynasty. And all this, of course, was during the time of the Abbasids. So you see how it's confusing, So that's why I wanted to bring these maps, but unfortunately we couldn't see it. And then after the Ayyubid, the Mamluks took over Egypt, and also a good part of the area around Egypt as well. So now we're getting into modern era, and I just all of that was just a preamble, just to show you kind of what was going on. So we see the Great Seljuk Empire. Again, what is the time period? 1096. So we're in the same time period as the Abbasid dynasty. So you see why, again, it's confusing. Because the Abbasids are still there, they still exist, but they become in a small, kind of area. And in fact, they became more like figureheads for the other people around them. So the ancestors of the Uthmani Empire is the Seljuks. The Seljuk Turks, they came from Transoxania. We talked about that region of near Uzbekistan and that area. And they eventually created this great Seljuk Empire. It was during this time that they actually entered into Asia Minor, or what was then the Byzantine Empire. And in Western education, we learn of it as the Byzantine Empire. But in fact, they called themselves the Eastern Roman Empire. So when the Arabs referred to them as Rum, they were actually correct, because they referred to themselves as the Eastern Roman Empire. And so they were Rum. So they took over much of Rum, except for one area. I'll point to it. And you see it's in Greek, but it's Constantinople, which is at this end. So that was not under their control. And also this part, which was the remainder portion of the Roman Empire, was still not under their control. But this was the Seljuk Empire. So you can see that the Seljuk Empire took over much of the Islamic state as we know it at that time. And then from there, now we have the Ottomans. So the Ottomans actually came, they were a small tribe in eastern Anatolia, in part of Turkey today. And they gradually sort of increased their rule, and you can't really see it very well. I apologize again for these maps, because they look better on my computer than on the screen. But you see somewhere in here, there it is, here, Bursa. Bursa was their capital, and then this is going into Greece, was modern day Greece. So, but you can see that they were essentially, if you look at it, they were a European dynasty. Because they, most of their rule started in this part of Eastern Roman Empire that they took over, and entered into Eastern Europe. And I'm going to just skip forward to the peak of their actual territorial size. And what you can see is they took over most of North Africa, with the exception of Morocco. They, of course, took the Arabian Peninsula, Sham, Iraq, parts of Iran, Armenia, and then they conquered Constantinople, and then what many of us don't realize through modern experience, they conquered all of Greece, and they ruled Greece for almost you can say like 300 or 400 years. So, very long period of time. In fact, if you look at Ottoman history, you'll see that the most esteemed non-Muslim status in their society was Greek. The Greeks had the highest positions in government for non-Muslims, and so they had a very high position. And in fact, the Greeks preferred to be under the Ottomans because they were persecuted by the Roman Catholics, the Western Roman Empire. So they actually preferred for many hundreds of years to be in that situation, and only at the last end of the Ottoman Empire did they actually leave the state. So that's just the maps, and of course the maps didn't pan out as I hoped. But anybody who wants this as a PowerPoint for home, I can send it to you. Send it to Brother Yusuf, and he can coordinate. So you can look at it more clearly. But I just wanted to again put us in certain landmarks. One, I talked about already the Fatimid control of Egypt, and then the rise of Osman I in 1300, and 1389 the Ottomans take Kosovo, and then 1453 Constantinople falls. 1517 they took over Egypt. They took from the Fatimids, from the Mamluks, sorry, at that time. And then just to give you a landmark, we always hear of Suleiman the Magnificent. That is from 1520 to 1566. So from the 1500s to about the middle of the 1600s is when the Ottomans had the peak of their sultanate. Now I'm going to talk about what happened afterwards, because that's the most important part for this lecture, but I just wanted to at least give us some common background to discuss this. So what you see, what happens after that? Ottoman-Safavid wars, which is on the east, they were being attacked by the Iranians or the Persians, and they were losing territory frequently until eventually they came to some sort of understanding in 1639. That's on the east. On the west, they were fighting the Saadian dynasty of Morocco, but not just them, but their alliances with Spain and other foreign powers to try and limit their spread west. On the north, the Russians were constantly attacking them, and so they were losing territory over time, until it came to the point where the only thing that was keeping the Ottoman state intact was actually the other Western powers. So we have in 1798, which is really the key time period for us to know about Muslim decline and what happened to the crisis of Islam, because it was that invasion of Egypt by France which now made it very clear to any intellectual or any thinking person in the Muslim world that something's wrong. Something is terribly wrong. We are being defeated militarily constantly. We are backward in our thinking intellectually. And when they saw all of the different technologies that were coming from the West, they were more and more impressed. And whether it was men or women, they were constantly looking and seeing what they were innovating and trying to understand what went wrong. And in fact, that's the name of a famous book about this time period, What Went Wrong. And so Napoleon came in 1798 to conquer Egypt, and he only lasted 2 years. But the reason he only lasted 2 years is because the Ottomans aligned with the British to help kick him out. Because the Ottomans themselves tried to kick him out, but they lost tens of thousands of troops over and over again because of inferior weaponry and so on and so forth. So they were impossible for them to kick them out. And in fact, what the Ottoman state later on was called was the weak man of Europe. I'm sure you've heard this term. And the reason for that was because it was Western Europe which was propping up the Ottoman state at the end, only for one purpose, to defend against Russia. So that was the purpose of the Ottomans at the end. And so But this time period in 1798 did result in one important thing, which is after that, we see, where do the intellectuals of the Muslim world go? They go to France. They go, many of them spend years in France. They spend years in France, they studied so many aspects of French culture, and they brought it back to Muslim world. Now, what else happens in the late 1700s is the rise of constitutions. So we have the Swedish Constitution of 1772, the United States Constitution of 1789, and the French Constitution of 1791. And Britain famously has no constitution, even to this day, but they have a series of laws and covenants and rules, so it amounts to the same thing, but they have their own structure. But in the Muslim mind, really, the thing that stood out was the French Constitution, because they saw the French, they invaded Egypt. They had, not only did they invade Egypt, but they brought hundreds and thousands of intellectuals and artisans and so forth to invade Egypt, not only with military, but with intellectuals and with their culture. And so then they opened themselves up for the Egyptians to go back all over the Muslim world to France to study. So they looked at the French Constitution, and also America was far away. They didn't really have that as a good example. So they looked at the French Constitution, and they frankly decided, and this is a Westerner making a joke about Muslims at the time finding reasons for the Constitution in the Quran, and that was something that happened because they were looking at why we were being destroyed, and they decided that one of the reasons is that we need this new thing, which everybody else is having, which is a constitution. And the Ottomans responded to this by what's called the Tanzimat Farman, or it's a decree. Farman means decree. And it was the response to constitutionalism. So when you see something in modernity, you have to respond. When you see constitutions rising, when you see nation states rising, and you see yourself declining and constantly losing militarily and in every single way, then you think, what is it about the other that they have that is so powerful? And what many people thought is constitutions are the thing that they have. And so they started this process of starting constitutions. They were hoping to strengthen the state by transforming the state, you see. They didn't anticipate or even think of the idea that they were going to be destroyed as a state. But they thought it was something they could do to strengthen themselves. So what happened with this? The Ottomans introduced paper currency for the first time. They opened post offices, they opened Ministry of Health, Stock Exchange, Bank, national ID cards. But the bottom part is what's most interesting, is the full legal equality for all citizens of all religions. So what happened to the Ottomans is that after these many losses, for example, to Russia, for example, every time they lost, they had to do a treaty. And in that treaty, they had to basically guarantee that the people that beat them, their citizens and their people inside of their region would have much better rights. And so gradually they had been giving different groups rights equivalent to Muslim citizens. And so they had been doing this already, and so by the time the Tanzimat were formed, they basically made it so that everybody has the same equal rights. And so let's move on. But so now I'm going to start talking about some of the intellectuals. So now you have an understanding, sort of, about the environment that they were growing up in, and what was and what they were responding to. Okay. So the first person I wanted to talk about was Rifat al-Dahtawi, and he was a graduate of Al-Azhar from 1801 to 1873, and he went to France, and you'll find this theme over and over again. Muslim intellectual, studied in Islamic schools and at the peak of Islamic learning. Then he goes to France, and he wrote, you'll see that the first part of that paper I gave you is his comments on the French Constitution. And then we have Khairuddin Tunusi, who was at one point a Grand Wazir, Grand Minister of the Ottoman state, but he's also kind of the heir or rather the ancestor to the thinkers Malik Benabi, Nabi, and Rashid Ghanouchi. Any of those who know about this region will know them. And he founded the school, Sadaqiyya school, combining Islamic and modern education. But why I mentioned them together is because they both were commenting on the constitutions of France, and they both had these basic key points. Governmental institution innovation is a scientific advancement, meaning that when these kinds of innovations of constitutionalism, of developing councils, of limiting the power of the king, these are a scientific advancement, and that we should take them for our benefit, meaning Muslims. And secondly, they said that consultation and checks on power are part of the Islamic tradition. We don't need to think of this as foreign. Rather, we need to implement this because this is part of the Islamic tradition. They gave an example, it's in their paper, of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, and when he was giving a talk, he said basically that if I say anything wrong, you should correct me. And then the person stood up that said, we will correct you with our swords. And he said, praise be to Allah, to this person, and people who correct me in whatever way is possible. So he basically was giving an example, and I'm sorry, that's a paraphrase, but the idea is this, that the Muslims, the early Sahaba, they never contemplated themselves in rulership as unrestrained, as people who just dictate to people and tell them what to do, as people who can do whatever they want, like a king. But rather they thought of themselves as someone who is constrained by the Sharia and constrained by the people around him who will correct him when something will go wrong. And so it was that concept which then later on, when constitutions came into being, these thinkers said, well, that is really an innovation which applies the same principle Islamically of shura, and so we should take that from them. And third is what I talked about in the beginning, that they saw that this type of government, they felt like, would lead to people being more free and thereby increasing their economic output and increasing their well-being and increasing the well-being of the state. So they tied all these three things together, and that is why they were very pro constitutions and shura and these assemblies. Now, I will talk about this idea of hadara and madaniya because it is the central key point of what they were trying to understand. It's something that even now, for us, we need to try to figure out and work out. Because, and I'll explain these terms. First of all, these terms are not universally used the same way. So if you look in the literature, some people will say hadara and madaniya are the same thing. Some people will say that they're different things. Some people, they both come from the Arabic word for settlement or city or something like this. So they mean civilization, okay? And so, at least some people have used them as hadara, meaning that it's part of a civilization, that part of, hadara is that part of a civilization that comes from their ideological background, meaning that it comes from the core of their identity, and madaniya being that part of a civilization which is a technical advancement that the civilization has made, and it's not part of their ideology. And so that we can take from their madaniya, but we shouldn't take from their hadara, because we have our own hadara, Islamic civilization. So this is the idea and concept that people have been trying to figure out. So is constitutions, is these assemblies, are they part of hadara or madaniya? And that was the question that these scholars were tackling, and at least they answered this question by saying it is madaniya. It is part of a technical advancement that basically implements the same the Islamic concepts of shura in a better way and in a more just way than we had before. So, but take that same concept, because this is what you would need to apply to any advancement that came from the West. Because you have to then apply the same metric. Is this part of the hadara of Western civilization, or is this part of madaniya? And even today, we have to look at that. Is TikTok part of the madaniya, or is it part of their hadara? or any of these things that you think about, the technology that you use, the ideas or concepts that you are adopting, you have to look at it and say, is this something that contradicts with the Islamic civilization and thought? Or is this something which is just a technical advancement that anybody could use? And in fact, this is just an example from modern day about the same concept. Ali Guma, who's the Mufti of Egypt, he told al-Masr al-Yawm that the concept of civil state doesn't contradict Islamic law, but conforms to it. And basically, he's using the same thinking that Rifat al-Tahdawi, which Khairuddin al-Tanusi, and these people back in the day had basically already formulated. But anyway, continuing. We have Sheikh Muhammad Abduh, who anybody who's familiar with Islamic history is well known. And his mentor, Sayyid Jamal ad-Din al-Albani, they became sort of well known together. And the third is Muhammad Abduh's student, Rashid Rida, and then that becomes the trifecta. And he is, of course, from Egypt. He graduated Al-Azhar, and he was famous because he was exiled to Beirut during the Al-Rabi revolt, and he later spent a lot of time in France. They wrote a journal called Al-Ghurwa al-Wuthqa, which is from the ayah of the Quran, the unbreakable bond, and they were basically forwarding Islamic challenges to Western civilization. That was the purpose of the journal. And it was, Westerners were saying, look at you guys, you're so backward. They were responding, no, that's not us. That's just the people. They've become backward, but Islam is light for all time, for all mankind. And the people have corrupted Islam, and that is why we're in this state. And basically, that was the purpose of this journal. But later on, he came back, and he was very famous for devising much of the reforms of Egypt later on. You'll see in your packet, I've included a series of questions that he posed. I don't, of course, Muhammad Abduh has written so many things, and in fact, if you know the history, you know that many of the things that other people said were in fact his ideas, because he didn't want to publish everything under his name, and so people would publish his ideas to spread the ideas, and other people would take the heat. He had more controversial ideas, in fact, that he didn't want to publish under his name. But I'm going to get sidetracked. So he was asking these questions. He said, if Islam granted to reason and will the honor of independence, then how has it bound them with such chains? Meaning, if Islam and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala elevated reason to such a high level, why are Muslims the most constricted in their reasoning? Meaning they have so many, there's slaves to so many different restrictions on how they can think. And if Islam established the principle of justice, why are the greatest part of its rulers models of tyranny? And you can think about that today, because it's the same question we ask ourselves. Why that if Islam is so great, that the Muslim nations are in such a bad condition? Why is it that if Islam elevated reason, then in Muslim nations you find the worst atmosphere for intellectual activity? Why is it that if we're supposed to fight against oppression, the most oppression you find are in Muslim nations, right? And so thinking about that is where he came up with his ideas later on. But that was the questions they were asking, and still I think we can ask those same questions. And his famous statement is, I went to the West and saw Islam but no Muslims, and I went back to the East and I saw Muslims but no Islam. And the same idea is that he was talking about is that the Islamic principles I see in the West, in terms of equality, in terms of intellectual freedom, in terms of freedom from oppression and tyranny, but I don't see Muslims. And when I come back, I see all of the elements that Islam has railed against, but I find it full of Muslims. So anyway, this is the famous statement that he made. Also, although women did not have much rights in the West even at that time, they did have more than the Muslim women that interacted with them. And in fact, many of them started to look at the Western women and say, what is wrong with us? that we're in such a backward condition, and why are we, slaves to the men in the household, as they put it. And in fact, this is a famous sister from Egypt, Bahithat al-Abadiyya. Her actual name was Malik Hifni Nasif, actually later on found out. But she wrote a series of articles, and it's in your packet if you want to read it, but some of that. But I just quoted one part of it, and it says that men say to us categorically, "You women have been created for the house, and we have been created to be breadwinners." And he said, "Is this what Allah, told us that you have to do? Because how are we to know, since no holy book has made it spelled out? And in fact, the division of labor is a human creation." So you see that women are starting to go back at these concepts that have built up over years. And in fact, Sheikh Muhammad Abdul raised many of the concerns about people marrying more than one wife and not having the capability to take care of them. And Qasim Amin is another thinker who was very, very adamant that Muslim men had and the society had been oppressing women to too much of a degree, where they became worse than slaves because they had less rights and so forth. And so he again was somebody who was advocating for greater autonomy. But you see that the kinds of reforms that this sister proposed at that time, you can think, are not something very controversial. They wanted to, first of all, teach them Quran and Sunnah, because they weren't getting proper Islamic education, much less any other education, and mandate primary and secondary education, and then set a quota for women in medicine. And at that time, she put education because she did not conceive of women doing anything else than, maybe teaching and doing medicine. But, now, of course, you have other fields. And of course, this is why she said we need the theory and practice of home economics, health and first aid and childcare, because so that women can understand basic, things in the home. And so, so you see, it didn't come to an extreme concept. Actually, you'll see in that paper some of her comments. She actually criticizes many of the Egyptian women because he says that they've started wearing dress which is similar to Western dress, and they've become even worse because they're even more revealing dress than Western women, and she advocates a different type of dress that the Turkish women are wearing. But anyway, Muhammad Rashid Rida was the most prominent student of Muhammad Abdul, and he wrote this periodical called Al-Manar, and that was a very famous periodical. It disseminated a lot of ideas in the Muslim world at the time. And some of his writings are more around the ideas that people on the other extreme were going, which is that we need to abandon Islam altogether because that is the source of our backwardness. So he said the ulama of Istanbul have a greater influence on the nation and the government. The ulama of Egypt do not even have a slightest share of influence, so how can we be accused of blocking civic progress? Where is the progress? Where have they put up such a practical resistance that government feared to make reforms? In fact, that he's responding to the fact that in Egypt people were saying, oh, these ulama are backward and they're blocking all the reforms, they're blocking all progress. He's saying, we hardly have any power, how are we blocking anything? And in fact, he said that these people are false renewers, because he quoted this hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, which is collected by Abu Dawud al-Hakim and Bayhaqi and others, that God sends to this nation at the beginning of every century someone to renew their religion. And so this is the concept of the Mujaddid. But there are false renewers who urge you to abandon the religion and entire Sharia, and they want you to imitate the heretics of Europeans in their hostility to religious scholars and accuse ulama as an insurmountable obstacle to the progress of the ummah. And in fact, you will see that idea even repeated to this day. Many people in Pakistan, for example, they blame the religious leaders for every single problem that's happening in the nation. And they say the claim of backwardness is related to them. But in fact, this is not the case. But and I thought this was just sort of something interesting at the time. They're urging the nation to take pride in donning the hat. At that time, they didn't wear hats, so they wore turban. They want you to wear the hat, but then also mixture of men and women, dancing hall, swimming, travel, They criticize the woman, call her household her prison, entice her to disobey and disregard her husband. And then he said, some even say she is fit for wars and fighting. So, I think this is, you can think this is, the early 1900s, and this change was happening. But the idea was that there were people pushing back at some of these things. They said not every progress is a legitimate progress. And not every renewal is a legitimate renewal. So, again, moving on. Jamaluddin al-Afghani, he was kind of the inspiration for Muhammad Abduh. And it's actually not even Afghani, actually, he's actually a Shi'i Muslim. He was born in northwest Iran, but he adopted this name Afghani so he can be more appealing to the rest of Muslims. In fact, a strange fellow. If you read his history, you'll see he was in India, he was in Iran, he was in Iraq, he was in Egypt, he was in France, he was in Russia, he was in Turkey. He spent the last few years in Turkey. He was all over the Muslim world and basically spreading certain ideas of renewal. It's hard to pin down exactly his concepts, but one of the things that I put in there was a few lectures he gave on science. And basically his ideas was that science is the reason why people are advanced. And science does not belong to any religion or any people. And it changes its capital whenever somebody else is advanced, science goes to that place. So his point was that it was intellectual decay and the lack of encouragement of science which caused Muslim decay. And that was his ideas. And also he went into philosophy and the fact that Muslims started advocating against philosophy as anti-intellectualism. So this was his concepts. So we'll move on. Mahmoud al-Alusi, this is the last thing I'm going to talk about, which is the scholars of Sham and actually of Egypt and of the Arabian Peninsula. They were. You can imagine that today you go into the library and you can find Majmu' al-Fatawa of Ibn Taymiyyah. You can find all of these books. Well, if you can think about it, the people of that time, they did not have access to large portions of these books that we have access to. In fact, every single day, I find some new volume has been printed of something that never before any Muslim had found for more than 100 or 200 years. And that's even happening right now. And the reason is that there was no large-scale collection of many of these ideas. And so, you had some in a private library here, some in a private library here. In fact, his colleague Al-Qasimi, at the same time, and this is the late 1800s, he said that I went all over Damascus trying to find a copy of Imam Shafi'i's Risala. Risala is the fundamental work of Usul al-Fiqh that actually people say was the first work of Usul al-Fiqh. And so it should not be that kind of difficult to find, but he could not find this book. And eventually he found it in one library. And so there actually was a great task that many of these scholars did, which is they collected and revived Islamic learning because they collected these books. But one of their favorites was Ibn Taymiyyah, Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, and they started finding his works in this library, in that library, in that library, in this waqf, in this waqf, in this waqf, and they collected it together into a central library, and they started republishing it and disseminating these ideas. And so the same way we have these reformers who are saying that everything about Islam is backwards and we need to adopt the West. Then we have reformers who are saying, no, there are some parts of Islam which the West has taken and made more modern, but it's really Islamic and we need to take it back. Second idea. Or the third, which is we need to reject the Islamic underpinning of the current government. And so this is where we get to the third wing of this time period. And that is the rise of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. We have the rise of Alusi and the Salafiyya movement. And their reasoning was exactly the same, which is that we are backwards. We need to find out what it is that is backwards about us. And they pinpointed the idea, the first and the most important thing that they thought was backward was the concept of taqleed, or imitation. And they were very harsh against imitation, and they said that you're allowed to do ittiba', which is following an opinion, but you're not allowed to do taqleed, which they determined is blind following. The difference that they cited. And the reason why they were so hard on this was because the Turks had set up schools of law. They made the 4 schools of law, the Hanafi school, the Hanbali school, the Shafi'i school, and the Maliki school, and they formalized them. And they made everybody have to be in one of those 4 schools, and so they made this a very concrete kind of structure. And so when their backlash is against the Turks, one of the things their backlash is against is this concept of taqleed, and they're saying that, in fact, taqleed is something that is not only not something we should do, but they went the opposite, which is it's haram to do, and no layperson should do it, and so on and so forth. This is something they were reacting to. We have Yusuf al-Nabhani, he's a Chief Justice of Al-Quds. Actually, anybody who knows Hizb ut-Tahrir, they can see he's the grandfather of Taqiyuddin al-Nabhani. And he was also a judge at that time. He quoted, he basically said, Ijtihad is not claimed today except by those of defective mind and religion, unless it is through wilaya, as by Sheikh Ibn Arabi. He's talking about through a spiritual process that happened. And he said that the Suyuti claimed ijtihad. Suyuti is quoting an earlier scholar, and his contemporaries attacked and criticized him en masse. And they said that he could not even do ijtihad al-fatwa, which means differentiating between the different fatwas of the Shafi'i school, not coming up with a new ijtihad, but even telling which of these fatwa is more stronger. And so he's saying that then who is the foolish person who thinks that they can do ijtihad al-mutlaq or ijtihad generally, and so he actually said ijtihad has been discontinued for about 1,000 years. That's what his opinion was. And so then the response to that was that the conditions for ijtihad are not impossible and may exist in any era, and the scholars in the past never claimed ijtihad was closed. And ijtihad is not the same thing as prophecy or nubuwwah. It cannot be terminated. And it is not possible for an era to be devoid of mujtahid. And also Ibn Arabi in some of his poetry claimed to be taking his opinions directly from the source. So of course he claimed to be mujtahid mutlaq. But again, that was some arguments against this. And like I said, they said, I heard Ahmad ibn Hanbal say, ittiba'a means following what comes from the Prophet and his companions, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And don't imitate me, don't imitate Malik, al-Thawri, al-Awza'i, but rather draw from the sources that they drew from. And another thing he said that the madhab is not appropriate for lay people. It is not imaginable that a lay person can properly have a madhab. If a hadith is sound, he should follow it. He should be free to pertain a legal opinion from any of the followers of the imams or others that he wishes. In fact, you see, this is the opinion that later on Sheikh al-Albani, if anybody knows of this famous scholar, he famously did not have any ijazat in hadith. He was self-taught and were taught by other scholars, but he didn't take ijazat. And part of the reason is that they were struggling against the ijazah system, because they said that this is it makes everything dependent on the structure of taqleed, and we want to destroy the structure of taqleed itself. So, if you think about it, and this is the last point I'm going to make, is that all of these reforms, they laid the foundation for every Islamic movement of the 20th century, because they are all basically trying to figure out what is it that the West had that was powerful and strong and that we should take? What is it that they had which is damaging and going to destroy the ummah from inside and we should reject? And what is it that we need to debate whether or not we should take it because it's more ambiguous? And what is it about our Islamic thinking which allowed us to get to this depressed level and how do we reform that? And so all of them, whether it's any kind of movements, even though if you think of them as separate movements and having vastly different ideas, but they were all challenging and trying to understand and trying to come up with answers to the same questions. And in fact, today we find ourselves trying to come up with answers to those same questions. What constitutes the core of Western civilization? What are technical innovations that are legitimate to take? What are the proper ways of learning the deen, right? What are, how should we structure that Islamic learning? Is it proper to do learning outside of the Ijaza system, for example? And also questions as to what are the causes of decay of civilization. And to answer that, then you know the answer for what is the core components of the revival of the Islamic civilization. So I hope that was helpful. But all of that is so, the more you can understand this time period in Islamic history, the more you will be able to think deeply about what are the answers for today. Because they struggled with exactly the same challenges that we dealt with, and they struggled with them, and now we're going back. After all, many people now are coming back at all of the people who have learned Islam in various ways and say, where is your ijaza in this? Where is your ijaza in that? Where is your, who is your teacher? And in fact, they don't realize that the last 40 years, people spent destroying the system because they felt it was constraining the mind of the Muslim, right? But now people are reestablishing that again. And so we need to know our past so that we can try to make a path forward. And so I hope this is a bit helpful in that, but there's more reading. What Went Wrong is a book which is useful to read. Bernard Lewis, famous Orientalist, had written that. And I have more documents from this time period. There's a source book called Modernist Islam by Charles Kurzman. He's a sociology professor at UNC, and it's a very good book if you can get it. It has many of these in more detail. So I'll now open to any questions.
Was very informative, very mighty, and good presenting. I just wanna, I just remember Sunnah al-Mudafa. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Surah al-Baqarah, ayah 252, 251. So, and in that ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, ولولا دفع الله الناس بعضهم بعض فسدت الارض ولكن الله ذو فضل على العالمين. In the rough translation, Allah did not shed one set of people by means of another. The earth will indeed be full of mischief, but Allah is full of bounty or the world. So this is Mudafa is what you presented here. This is the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us alive. And Muslims, in my opinion, they do not rise up unless they are pushed down. And when they push down, they start going back to the original, to the source, and they start rising up by Islam, not by who they are, but they see the value of Islam. And that's what raised up and survived us all these years. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually there's many Westerners who said this is there's an opportunity in every crisis. So it's the same idea. You need and if you don't have a crisis, you need to create a crisis to create the opportunity. And so sometimes you have to create a crisis if you don't have one. And they're very masters of that in Western society. But I mean, we don't need any crisis to be created. We have so many crises, So yeah, I mean, of course, alhamdulillah, inshallah, that's what we hope, that these kinds of crises will create, the personalities and the ideas that will carry and renew Islam in the future. Because obviously, somebody sitting comfortably in their home with no worries at all is hardly the person who's going to make any new ideas and challenge anything. Whereas somebody who's lost everything and everything is destroyed around them, they'll come up and say, well, I need to do something to change my condition and come come up with a solution. No. All right, young people, learn any new things? Any questions?
Learned a lot of new things. There's a lot to have questions about.
Yeah, it's a lot. I was thinking this is too much for one talk, but that's why I gave you guys those papers so you can read. They're English translations, so I apologize for the Arabic speakers. You can try to find the originals.
Can you mention something about education in the Abbasiyin and Ottomaniyin before the colonization French came? How the structure of education inside the nation Arabic changed?
Yeah, well, in particular North Africa, I can't go into too much detail, but it's very famous that part of North Africa was like 70 or 80% literate before the French came. And when the French came and destroyed the existing structure, literacy went down to 20 or 30%.
No, how do you explain in the century?
Yeah.
In century two, when it was big, when it was like Muslim people, when they have education, they have education, religions education.
Yes. Well, yeah.
When they grown up, they have different education like math, philosophy, medicine,
Right.
the same way.
Yeah, so actually there's a very interesting book by George Maqdisi, and it talks about the rise of educational systems. And he goes into detail about how the European systems of education, basically they took from the Muslims of North Africa that they interacted with, they took their system and then they applied it more broadly. So for example, the Ijaza system in this sense was the first PhD. You know, you would get Ijaza and then you could teach. That was your certification. And, you know, of course, the education was, as you said, it started off, every education was Islamic education. It was, you know, learn the basics of the deen, you learn the Quran, you learn hadith. And then, along with that, you learn the adab, the letters, the literature, okay? And then you learn grammar, you learn rhetoric, you learn logic. And then along with logic, then you learn, you know, rhetoric, you learn the Greek philosophical ideas about learning logic. You know? And so, and then from that, you learn mathematics and geography. And so mathematics was one of the elevated fields of that time because it was there's no debating mathematics. Mathematics is right or wrong. And so it's considered one of the highest fields. And so everyone started on the same path of Islamic education, and then they specialized in areas that they were more interested in. And that's why you find many of the scholars like, you know, that the West took like the science of medicine from, like Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, and others. They were also Islamic scholars first before they were any other scholars of any other topic. But to your point, yeah, they took that Ijaza system, and in fact, in Italy is where they first kind of took all of the ideas because there was in Sicily, there was a very famous ruler there. He was very interested in all of the Islamic sciences, so he took as many books as he could, and he started creating kind of a system of learning that mimicked what the Muslims were doing. But what they did is that they took the Ijaza in Islamic topics, which is the only Ijazat that were given. At that time in the Muslim world, the Ijazat were only in Sharia and different types of things like this. They weren't in like mathematics or astronomy or so forth. And what they did is they took the same concept and they started it in all these fields. So that's why you have a master's in astronomy, you have a PhD in astronomy. So, you know, this, so they took the same structure and the university structure, but they expanded it. And in fact, if you look at it carefully, the reason why there is Protestantism and Catholicism, it rises from these people that were being taught in this university system in Italy that they drove from the Islamic concepts, and all of a sudden you had large groups of non-clergy who were sort of clergy, and they had been educated, and then they became, you know, in kind of they found the same ideas that Muslims had been thinking about for many years of Aristotle and Plato and all these things, and what is the nature of Allah, what is the nature of God, and so then they challenged the Catholic Church, you know, and that's how Martin Luther started Protestantism, because behind him there were thousands of other similar people to him who had studied in these universities, which they learn from the Muslims of North Africa. And so, you see there's a connection to the whole thing. I don't know if that answered your question, but that was. Oh, 9 o'clock? We at 9 o'clock? Yeah. Okay, Jazakallah khairan.
Actually, we all did. We all did work. How was it like this year?